So this is Unit 1, Module 3, Lesson 1. We're going to talk about debugging today. But no conversation about debugging would be complete without talking about Grace Hopper. So there's a link to a video in Blackboard about Grace Hopper. I'd like you to click on that video link, and it should take you to a page that looks like this. So it's the Grace Hopper video with her on David Letterman. Watch that and then come back to this video. So now that you've watched that video, you'll know a little bit more about Grace Hopper and her conversations about the sizes of nanoseconds and picoseconds. And she's a really interesting and funny lady. But one of the things that she's well known for is popularizing the term, there's a bug in the code. Now, this is not something that she first came up with. You know, the conversation about bugs being computer codes was there. But she was the first one to actually find a bug in the computer code. She was working on her computer, the Mark I, and there was a problem in the relay, and she actually found the bug and then taped it right to the logbook and wrote first actual case of a bug being found. So she ended up popularizing that and actually gets the term kind of assigned to her as being the first person to really kind of coin the phrase, there's a bug in the code. So what really is debugging? Well, programmers often find flaws in their code, and it's not uncommon to find a mistake, and we call those mistakes or errors, we call them bugs. So these bugs will cause the code to work incorrectly or sometimes not even run at all. There are lots of strategies that you can use to overcome these mistakes, and we're going to look at those in this module here. So in programming, coding faults come into three kind of flavors. You have syntax errors, you have runtime errors, and you have logical errors. And the process of sorting out those different types of computer bugs is called debugging. So syntax errors is the first error. It's when your program does not run because your code doesn't follow the syntax rules of the language or the rules defining the arrangement of the language. Maybe you spelled something wrong, or you forgot a parenthesis, or in Python you forgot to tab something in, or you just forgot a capitalization. There's lots of things that can go wrong when you're typing code. So it's important that you're very careful when you're copying and typing in code or even creating your own code, because you want to avoid those syntax errors. And as you'll see later, that sometimes finding those syntax errors can be very challenging. So that's the first type of error. The second type of error is called a runtime error. So your program runs, but then stops for some reason. What might cause that? Well, suppose, for example, you're doing a math calculation and you end up dividing by 0. Well, you're not allowed to divide by 0 in math, but the computer won't see that until the program actually runs. And at that point, when you divide by 0, that's when the computer says, hey, you can't do that. Or maybe the user is asked for some information, and maybe the user enters in the wrong kind of value. Maybe they enter in a decimal, and you're expecting an int, or they enter a string, and you're expecting a number. That can cause problems for you as well. Or maybe you're taking a square root of a negative number. So all different kinds of reasons that could end up causing the computer to stop while running. You may probably have found this yourself working on a computer program where all of a sudden the program just shuts down, or some type of error occurs, or maybe it's a phone app and the phone app stops working. Those are all runtime errors, and you can see that because they still go out in production for programs that you have on your devices, that we don't always find the runtime errors. And they're also challenging to debug and find. So a lot of times you'll find updates are put out where we get an update to a piece of software that they have found some type of runtime error in, and they're fixing it. So it's important to install those updates because they're really trying to fix mistakes that are in the code. The last one is a logical error. This is when the program runs, but it doesn't do what you expect it to do. So maybe, for example, it produced some measures of music, but it's not exactly where you wanted the measures of music. Maybe you wanted 9 measures, but it really only gave you 8 because you kind of figured out the code wrong. Or maybe it's stuck in an infinite loop, or some type of problem is going on with your code, but it does run. In EarSketch, logical errors can be fixed by looking at the DAW. That's where your output, or looking at the console to make sure you're getting the correct output there. Those two sources will let you know if there's some type of logical error and the program is not functioning the way you expect it. So, how do you debug a program? What do you do? Well, there's a couple techniques that we're going to look at. One of the first techniques is using comments and documentation. So if you understand what the code is supposed to do by looking at the documentation and it doesn't do it, that's a clear source of a logical error. But you can also use comments within the code to kind of help yourself narrow down where the error is and kind of mark your place. You can also use comments to comment out a section of code to try to narrow down where the problem might be. If there's nothing else left but one line of code, then that line of code must be where the problem is. You can also log the output from your program, adding some extra print statements to see what exactly your program is doing step by step to try to figure out where the mistake is actually happening. Because again, sometimes that mistake can be misleading where in the code that mistake is. A little bit more on that. Sometimes people forget that computers only do what we ask them to do. The concept of GEICO, garbage in, garbage out. So if you're asking the computer to do something, it's trying its best to understand your instructions. And maybe you intended something else, but that's not what you asked the computer to do. So sometimes we have to separate our intention from our actual code. And sometimes we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the computer and make sure we're following what the computer's doing step by step rather than what we think it should be doing step by step. Finally, you can use the console. So at the bottom, if there's some type of error, it will display an error. Usually these are where your syntax and syntax and compiler errors show up, or runtime errors show up. They're difficult to find because sometimes the syntax errors are helpful and they explain exactly what the error is and it's really clear. They tell you what line number the error is on, but sometimes they're not so clear. Sometimes the error actually occurs earlier in the program than the line number the computer is talking about. So it's up to you to try to figure out where in the program that is. This is just where the computer first experienced the error, but the mistake may have been earlier. So now that you've learned a little bit about debugging, do the exit ticket, and then try the practice assignment. And remember, never stop coding. See you next time.